where does this instrument come from? What source did you use to reconstruct this thing?
I've been very lucky in that I've collaborated with very creative and curious instrument builders who are themselves in contact with archaeologists. There's a whole branch of archaeology called musical archaeology, which involves early instruments, going back as far as Neanderthal man and coming all the way into the early Middle Ages. Anywhere where something can be dug up or any kind of remains can be found, archaeology plays a huge role. And there was an extremely well-documented and famous excavation in England in the 1930s at Sutton Hoo, which has actually been in the news quite a bit these days, thanks to a film in Netflix, in which a ship burial was unearthed. And it was a ship that had been buried in the earth with its noble deceased. And he was surrounded by all kinds of goods and luxury items that he should take with him into the next world, whatever that was. And of course, the focus was on the beautiful mask, war mask, the helmet, a sword, various golden jewelry pieces and bowls and other objects. But there was also a harp buried with him. And this harp could be more or less reconstructed by comparing it with similar harps found in other grave sites, especially in Germany, where remarkably similar instruments were found under remarkably similar circumstances in a time roughly between the 6th and 7th centuries. So that's really a time after the Romans have left and before the Carolingians have imposed more or less unity on Western Europe.
So you actually have the physical instruments that you can reconstruct, which is amazing. You don't have to just rely on, a picture in a tapestry or something.
No, well, we do have pictures. Luckily, we have beautiful pictures in manuscripts, of course, largely in psalters, which, depending on when they're made, they always will show King David with his harp, because that's the tradition. And every artist will interpret that harp according to his own view of what a harp is. So the word was kitara, and it could look like a triangular harp, but in the early period, in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, it basically looked more like what we would call a lyre today. And that's what you see King David playing. So we have depictions of that instrument, which tell us things about how it was held, whether it was plucked or strummed. We can learn something about the number of strings. We can learn something about its proportions in relation to the body size of the player. And that's very helpful for us to know. But these recovered instruments, most of which were quite fragmentary, give us actual information about things like what kind of wood was it made of? How was this wood fashioned? How was the sound box made? How were the arms made? How did the pegs function, etc.? And there was another excavation more recently, just after the year 2000, while digging up a parking lot in Germany. They ran across a huge Merovingian field of tombs and graves, and they found a harp which was carbon dated to the year 580 and was in remarkably good shape. It survived almost intact. Not the strings, but the pegs and the corpus of the instrument all survived intact. And that's an instrument which has been restored and can now be seen in the Archaeological Museum in Konstanz, which is on the Swiss-German border. And several harp builders have in the meantime made copies of this instrument. They've gotten from the museum all the specs they needed, all the dimensions and the wood type and how it was put together, and used that to make copies. or reconstructions of such an instrument. And then someone like me comes along, a player, and I try to figure out how this instrument can actually be used in the telling of stories or the singing of songs or whatever musical type I think it should be used for. So there are many pieces to this puzzle, and they all center around the instrument, because the instrument is the keystone that gives us something fixed. It says to us something about pitch. And
right, because the voice, you can sing any number of pitches you want.
Yeah,
you could do a chromatic. You could be a chromatic bard if you wanted to.
Well,
but
I mean, the voice is, of course, the most magnificent instrument in the world, because it does everything. It makes specialty noises. It sings melismas. It sings high notes. It sings loud. It sings soft. It does speech. It does song. It does something between speech and song. It has a wide spectrum of possibilities, all the way to things like whispering and shouting and screaming. You know, the voice is simply an amazing instrument, and I don't see any reason why one of these singers of tales, whose job is to ennoble and entertain his listeners, didn't make use of all the possibilities of the human voice when doing so.
But playing the harp, of course, limits your kind of your note choices, I suppose, depending on how it's
it
tuned.
does. I spoke earlier about mode. I think what the harp does in this case is it determines the mode. So once you've fixed yourself on a tuning for the instrument, you've also fixed the mode for that particular piece you're going to perform. If you want to change the mode, you change the tuning, which is an operation that takes a little bit of tuning up and down of various strings. It destabilizes the instrument a little bit, but it can be done. So there's no such thing as transposing or modulating or any of that kind of stuff. There are no chromatics. You have really, in the case of most instruments which had 6 strings, that was sort of the rule. The 6 strings give you really an enormous amount of information. Our reaction would be to say, oh, that's terribly limiting. How can one make music with 6 strings? But actually, 6 strings is a richness of material.
So how did you settle on a mode to which this harp would be tuned, and what mode did you choose?
Well, I've not got one mode. I've used several.
Okay.
It's just my own personal choice that for different kinds of pieces I do different modes. Basically, the tuning of the instrument comes from a selective process. I could demonstrate it. I have the instrument here, if that would be
sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, this is one such harp. There are several possible ones. This is a copy made from an instrument of the 7th century, unearthed in Germany in the 19th century. So here you have, it's kind of long, so I'll have to sail it by the camera.
Now, you didn't use this one, Beowulf. I think you used something else.
I've used one similar to it.
I see.
In the DVD I made, I used this instrument.
Okay.
And one can see it's very, very slender. It's very shallow. And it looks like a plank of solid wood, but it's actually hollow inside. If you tap on it, you hear that it's hollow inside. So it's been hollowed out, and the top's been glued back down. This is a movable bridge made of any hard material. Could be wood, could be bone, could be amber. That is really a variable. And the 6 strings are attached to a tailpiece here, which is itself affixed to the end of the instrument. So the 6 strings go to the 6 pegs, and there are no frets. There's nothing else than the 6 strings. That's what you have. And if I play a series of tones on this instrument, again, I had said earlier, we have to decide if this instrument is going to be tuned randomly or whether it's going to be tuned according to some system. So that's a binary decision. And I decided it's not tuned randomly. Why would they bother to make such a thing if it's randomly tuned? So it must have a system, which means the strings must be in some relationship to one another. And that relationship can't be extreme, because string materials being what they were in the 7th century, you can't have extremely thick strings and extremely thin strings. You can have a thinner string, a medium string, a thicker string. That's about as far as one can expect. The strings are made of sheep gut, which has been twisted and cured, and that's generally considered the best material for string making. So on this instrument, I take a rather thick string and I tune it down to the point where it starts to lose focus and it starts to not sound so good. That's a kind of critical moment for a string. And that tone can be anywhere between F or G, depending on the length of the instrument. So there we have that tone. That happens to be a tone which matches my singing voice as a sort of middle register. And I can actually sing an octave below the string if I need to, but it's in the middle somewhere. So I've tuned already, without tuning anything, I've tuned 1 of 6 strings. And then comes the point where you say, oh, okay, the strings are in some relationship to one another. What would be the obvious relationships of strings to one another that would give us some benefit, some that we could use somehow in our performance? And I think that then my idea at the time, which I've changed over the years, but it is still a valid idea, is that the highest possible string in relation to this one I just tuned would be the one an octave higher. So strings 1 and 6 are in a relationship of 1 octave. So there's 2 out of 6 strings already accounted for. Then if you take what we know about medieval music theory, and indeed musical harmony ideas that date back to Pythagoras and beyond, you as a musician will also know that after the unison and the octave, the next most perfect interval is the perfect fifth. And I said, okay, I will tune a perfect fifth up from the lowest string. So there's my lowest string, and I'll tune a fifth above it. With that octave I had tuned earlier, I get automatically the perfect fourth. Sorry, it's a bit out of tune. I won't change it now. So we have the fifth, and the fourth, and the octave. Then I could say, by the same token, I could tune perfect fifth down from the top string, which would give me this. And the perfect fourth, which results. So the fifth and the fourth are important intervals in all music, but especially in medieval music. And it doesn't matter whether you're coming from Christian tradition or pagan tradition. There's something universally harmonic and harmonious about the octave, the unison, the fourth, and the fifth. So I have now 4 out of my 6 strings tuned. And anybody would recognize that right away as a kind of gapped off octave. It has a slightly pentatonic feel to it.
Right.
There's no half step anywhere. And in the middle, I have a perfect step, a perfect whole tone, which is an important interval as well. So then it's only a matter of tuning strings 2 and 5, which are kind of, I view those as strings which can change their identity easily. This is the stable middle of the instrument. And strings 2 and 5 are less stable. They have a secondary color. But they probably should be in a relationship to one another, similar to the other fifths. So another fifth. And I get that by tuning fourth down, and then a fifth up. So I have primary sound and secondary. And this gives me these 6 tones.
Yeah. So from like a major scale perspective, you would be leaving out essentially the 3rd and the 7th.
Yeah. But I have another tuning, which is the tuning I actually use for Beowulf. This is tuned for something else right now,
Oh.
which has the minor third instead of the 3rd up at the top. There's my minor 3rd. It has the minor
Right.
3rd down here where there's a step, and I just shift.
I see.
I shift those strings 2 and 5 by 1/2 step, and I get a completely different mode.
Wow.
So that's how that works. The strings, I almost never 1, 3, 4, and 6. I almost never change. They're very, very stable. It's really powerful, grounded sound.
Right.
But strings 2 and 5 have identity issues. They sometimes go this way.
Sure.
They sometimes go that way, and they give different colors. And depending on the nature of the piece I'm performing, sometimes it's an elegy. Sometimes it's a story song, which is not very violent, but just tells a story. Sometimes it's something like Beowulf, which is heroic. Then I need different kinds of tunings. And at that moment, it does become a bit subjective. Then it's me today, modern person, saying, for this text, I would prefer this tuning. So there is that element of it as well. One can never take oneself out of the process entirely.